everyone, we're going to be looking at the autonomic nervous system today. So when we look at the autonomic nervous system, this is what we would consider a kind of subdivision when we look at the nervous system as a whole. So when we look here, you can see that the nervous system is going to be branched into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, of course, consists of your brain and your spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system is going to branch out into the somatic and autonomic regions. Now, when we look at somatic is going to deal mostly with your skeletal muscles, and this is going to be where you have some voluntary control over. But the autonomic, the name tells you there with auto, that this is going to be automatic. This is going to be something that your brain does control, but you're not conscious of it. Now, the autonomic system is going to be even subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, when we look at the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems of the autonomic branch, we see that they are going to talk to your smooth or visceral muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. Okay, and when we look at this, remember it does have an involuntary effect, meaning that you do not consciously realize that this is occurring. Now again, this is going to have the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division also gets named as your fight or flight. And then the parasympathetic division, which is termed a lot of times your rest and digest. And we're going to take a little closer look at each of these divisions. We're going to look at how there are some similarities and then also how there's some differences. And there's mostly differences because they do opposite things. So let's take a look at a comparison between somatic and autonomic divisions first. When we look at the somatic side of the sensory neurons, we see that they are going to be consciously perceived. In other words, your brain is going to register the information that's coming in, and you're going to be aware of that. The sensory input, the information that's coming into the brain, is going to come from your special senses like your eyes, ears, nose, and taste. We also see that some of your general somatic senses also will send up information. So like pain, temperature, touch, tickle, itch, those types of things will also be perceived. On the autonomic side, though, those senses are not going to be consciously perceived. You're not going to register consciously or be aware that this information is coming into the brain. Now, this information can still come from the special senses, like your eyes and your ears and that sort of thing, but you're not aware of that. And also your general somatic senses, but most of these are going to be in your general visceral receptors. When we look at the visceral receptors, guys, these are the interoceptors, the ones on the inside. And these are going to be your internal organs. They may be telling your brain that they're full when we talk about like your bladder or your stomach. They may be telling you that your blood pressure is too high or too low based on the stretch on your blood vessels. Okay, so this information is going to be going into the brain, but it's going to be coming more from internal types of neurons. On the motor side, when we look at the somatic motor neurons, their cell body is found in the central nervous system. A single neuron synapsis is going to come directly into contact with the effector. The effector is the muscle that it's talking to. And that particular neuron is going to release acetylcholine. So the neurotransmitter it releases is acetylcholine. So something you're going to notice automatically off the bat with the autonomic motor neurons is there's actually two. There's a pre-ganglionic and there's a post. So when we look at pre means before, post means after. So the pre-ganglionic motor neuron, its cell body is going to be found in the central nervous system. It is going to have a myelinated axon. It's going to come out of the central nervous system, and they release acetylcholine, and they're going to release this to the second motor neuron. Okay, so the neurotransmitter they give off is also acetylcholine. But the postganglionic motor neuron, its cell body is going to be in the autonomic ganglion. This is outside of the central nervous system, so it's part of the peripheral nervous system. A lot of times this particular neuron is going to be unmyelinated. Its axon's not going to have that special insulation around it. And it's going to be the one that synapses or comes in contact with the effector. Now remember, the effectors here when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. This particular neuron could release acetylcholine, and it does this if it's part of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, or it may release norepinephrine if it's part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so there's going to be a distinction even here in the postganglionic based on if it's parasympathetic or sympathetic. So when we look at structure-wise, you can see some differences here. This top picture is showing you the somatic nervous system, the information coming through the motor neuron. You'll notice there's one motor neuron talking directly to the skeletal muscle here. The nucleus is found in the spinal cord, so in the central nervous system. You'll also see that the acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that it releases. On the other hand, when we look down here at the two bottom pictures, we are seeing that these are part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the top one is going to be, when I say at the top out of these two, is going to be the sympathetic, and the bottom one is the parasympathetic. You will notice that the cell body for the preganglionic neuron, for both of these, is found in the spinal cord, so the central nervous system. The axon is going to leave that spinal cord and it's going to come in contact with another neuron. This is the second motor neuron. You'll notice here that both of these do release acetylcholine, but here comes the difference. When we go to the postganglionic neuron is going to release norepinephrine when we're talking about the sympathetic system. That's where the NE comes in. On the other hand, the parasympathetic is going to continue to release acetylcholine on its second motor neuron. So there's some differences that are going to be automatically coming into play here when we look at parasympathetic versus sympathetic. So let's take a look at the sympathetic division first. When we look at the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, we see that the preganglionic cell bodies are located a lot of times in the lateral gray horn, which is found between T1 and L3. So remember, T here is talking about thoracic. So this is thoracic nerve 1 all the way down to lumbar nerve 3. So when we look at T1 to L3, so these are kind of in the middle of the spinal cord. So a lot of times these are going to be termed, because they're in the thoracic and lumbar regions, this is called the thoracolumbar division, okay, because it's in the thoracic and lumbar regions. On the other hand, the parasympathetic division, its preganglionic cell bodies are also located in the spinal cord, but they're going to be found when we look at the cranial nerve nuclei of the brain stem, which is the lower part of the brain, but where the spinal cord comes in contact with the brain, and the lateral gray horns of S2 to S4. Okay, so S here is the sacral. So these are normally going to be termed the craniosacral division because they're on the two ends. So the parasympathetic on the two ends and the sympathetic is in the middle. In addition to the ganglia, the autonomic nervous system also contains what we would consider some autonomic plexuses. A plexus is, when we're looking there, is like a group of neurons that are together. The sympathetic, when we look at this, the ganglia are going to be closer to the spinal cord with their plexus. It makes kind of like a net. You can see you have like the cardiac plexus, the pulmonary plexus, the esophageal. Okay, you can see them and they're closer to the spinal cord. Whereas the plexuses of the parasympathetic system are going to be closer to the organs that they're talking to. So the ganglia are closer to the organs, further away from the spinal cord. All right, so response to neurotransmitter. Guys, it depends on what the neurotransmitter is and who it's talking to. Okay, what particular neuron or effector is it talking to? The somatic response, though, is normally it's going to excite the effector. It's going to cause the actual muscle to contract. That's normally what we look at happening with the somatic. But in the autonomic, it may vary. It might excite the organ, it might excite the tissue, or it may inhibit the tissue, okay, cause it to settle down in that sense. Now, when we look at this, guys, as you might recall, each neuron is going to receive lots of information at once. Tons of neurotransmitters are coming into each neuron, and it's going to depend on how many exciting neurotransmitters it gets versus the inhibitory. If there's more exciting, it's going to excite the neuron. If there's more inhibiting, it's going to inhibit the neuron. Okay, so it's kind of a sum of these different neurotransmitters coming in. This will determine what the nerve will actually do, or even the effector, what it will do. All right, so let's do a little overview here of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. When we look at the somatic, we see that the sensory input, when we look at this, is the general and special senses. Whereas the autonomic is going to be the more internal, the interoceptors or the visceral. It still will get some of its information from your general and special senses as well. When we look at the motor control, remember that the somatic is voluntary. It's coming from your cerebral cortex and you're aware of what you are doing. Whereas the autonomic is involuntary. This is going to be mostly your hypothalamus and your limbic system in the brain controlling this. The motor neural pathway, does it have one motor neuron or does it have two? Somatic has one. It's one neuron talking to the effector, whereas in the autonomic, it's two. That's why we have the preganglionic and the postganglionic. Well, who is it talking to? With the somatic system, it's talking to the skeletal muscles. The autonomic, it's talking to the cardiac and smooth muscles. All right, so again, we're seeing this difference that's happening here. We have one neuron talking directly to the skeletal muscles for somatic. And in the autonomic, we have two neurons, pre and post, and they're going to talk to the cardiac muscle, your smooth muscles, or your glands. Now, what's the response? Again, it's going to depend. When we talk about the somatic side, it's going to normally cause a contraction of the muscle to occur. When we look at the autonomic, though, it depends. It depends on what neurotransmitter is coming in and who is it talking to. For your heart rate, the cardiac muscle, we see it could increase it or it could decrease it. For smooth muscle, it could cause contraction, but it could also cause relaxation. And when we look at glands, it could increase their secretion or it could decrease their secretion. And again, it depends on if it's part of the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division, which we're going to get into a little more in just a moment. All right, so now let's do a little bit of a comparison between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, when we look at the sympathetic, the preganglionic cell bodies are going to be in that thoracolumbar area. But in the parasympathetic, they're on the two ends, so this is the craniosacral. Now, location of the ganglia. With the sympathetic, we see it's going to be closer to the spinal cord, closer to the central nervous system. And the parasympathetic is going to be close to the viscera. Now, remember, viscera is talking about the organ, the internal organ that it's going to communicate with. Now, let's take a quick look at the length of the preganglionic axons. Okay, so that first one leaving the spinal cord, is it a short axon or is it a long axon? Well, if we're looking at the sympathetic, since it's close to the central nervous system, those are short. They didn't have to travel very far. But since the parasympathetic is closer to the organs, those are going to be longer. Okay? It's further away from the central nervous system. Now let's look at the type of preganglionic neurons. Are these neurons going to be cholergenic? And when we talk about cholergenic, this means do they release acetylcholine and neurotransmitters similar to that? Or are they androgenic, which is going to mean do they release epinephrine or norepinephrine? So if we look here, both of these are cholergenic. They're going to both release acetylcholine. So in this particular case, there's no difference in what they are releasing, okay, to the post-secondary neuron. Now, what type of post-secondary neuron do we have? Is it going to release acetylcholine or is it going to release something like norepinephrine? Well, when we look at the sympathetic system, it's going to be androgenic, which means it's going to release epinephrine or norepinephrine. If we look at the parasympathetic, it's also cholergenic, which means it's going to release acetylcholine again. Now, the duration of effects. Is this a long-lasting type of effect or is it a short-term? So when we look at the sympathetic nervous system is going to have a longer-lasting effect, whereas the parasympathetic is going to be more short-term. Okay, so if you'll notice, on most cases, when we're looking at sympathetic to parasympathetic, they are opposites. The only thing that is exactly the same is when we look at the type of preganglionic neuron. That is where they are the same. So let's take a little look here at the sympathetic division. A lot of times it gets represented with an S, and this is what we would call the thoracolumbar division. Now, we see that this particular division is going to prepare the body for emergency type situations. If you're stressed, a lot of times we say that they do either the 3 F's or the 4 E's. The 3 F's are things like fear, fight, or flight. So when you're scared, when you have this ability where you feel like you need to fight your way out or you need to run away, this is what's going to take over. The 4 E's are things like exercise, excitement, emergency, or embarrassment. Okay, so those will also kick in this division. These activities are going to use up energy. Your body is going to require more energy during this time. During physical or emotional stress, the sympathetic division is going to dominate over the parasympathetic. It's going to take over in those situations. Now, the effects of the sympathetic division tend to be more long-lasting. The chain ganglia are located again close to the central nervous system, close to the spinal cord. This means the preganglionic axons are going to be shorter and the postganglionic are going to be longer because they have to go to the actual organ. The preganglionic motor neurons are going to release acetylcholine. The postganglionic neurons, however, are going to release norepinephrine. These sympathetic fibers are found throughout the entire body, which you can see here in this diagram. We see that they're going to communicate to lots of different areas of the body. Now, one thing that's really unique about the sympathetic nervous system is that it has a direct innervation of the adrenal glands. It's going to communicate with the adrenal glands in a different way than it does all these other organs that you see in the picture. They're directly going to innervate the adrenal glands with the sympathetic preganglionic axons. So this is where only the myelinated fibers are going to come in contact. So this means that the information is going to get there a whole lot faster because of the myelination. Now, the cortex of the adrenal glands, or the outer part, those are going to be endocrine glands that secrete a lot of what we would call adrenocorticosteroid hormones. We see that the medulla part, the inner part of the adrenal glands, are going to secrete neurotransmitter hormones like norepinephrine and epinephrine. And they're going to do this in response to stress. Now, because of this, the effects are going to happen on all visceral organs as well. But this is where these are traveling through the bloodstream and not just through the nervous system. So here's showing you a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine or hormone system right off the bat. This is one of the reasons, though, that this system is going to have a longer lasting effect. Because not only are we relying on the nervous system to keep that fight or flight going, it's also going to be hormones that are released. And once hormones are in the bloodstream, it's going to have a longer lasting effect. Now, the purpose of the whole point of having this direct innervation is in order for it to amplify the sympathetic stress response and make it stronger in order for you to be able to survive. Okay, when we talk about that whole idea of fight or flight. All right, so let's take a look here at the parasympathetic division, or what we call the PS division. This is, remember, also the craniosacral because they're on the two ends. This is going to be the system or division that returns the body to its calm state. This is why a lot of times we call it the rest and digest. It's the calm state. It's involved in getting and saving energy in order to get that energy, store it up so that you have it to utilize during the sympathetic times. It also is going to be the time that you're going to eliminate waste, like urination, defecation. We're going to get rid of all that waste product during this time. We also see that the term slud can come into play. This is when salivation occurs. Lacrimation, so tearing, making of tears, urination, and defecation. All right, these processes are going to stop to a point, and they're going to be hindered during the sympathetic. In the parasympathetic, these processes are constantly occurring. Now, the effects of the parasympathetic division tend to be more short term. This means the nervous system has to constantly send the signal in order for it to continue. Preganglionic axons are longer. Okay, this means that the ganglion is going to be further away from the central nervous system. Pre and postganglionic nerves, when we talk about the motor side, they're going to both release acetylcholine, which means they're both going to be cholergenic. The parasympathetic fibers are found mostly in your head region, your thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. Okay, and when we look at this, guys, you can see that they are still talking to a lot of the same places that we saw for the sympathetic, but it's a little more widespread, like it's not as concentrated. All right, and so when we look here, it's a little bit different. Doesn't seem to have as much going on. You'll also notice that some of the cranial nerves are part of this parasympathetic. You can see there where it says vagus nerve, and that's vagus nerve 10 or cranial nerve 10. They also may play a role in the parasympathetic division. Now, guys, most organs do receive messages or impulses from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. If they do, this means that they have what we call a dual innervation. Now, dual means two. So this might mean that the heart is going to be connected to the sympathetic over here and the parasympathetic over here. That's the dual. So it's both. So it has to listen to both sides. Usually one division causes the organ or tissue to be excited, and the other one is going to inhibit it. Now, this is not always the same division though. Like for the heart, we see that the sympathetic is going to excite it and it's going to beat faster. And the parasympathetic is going to relax it so that you're in a more restful state. But if we look at the stomach's going to get excited by the parasympathetic, not the sympathetic. And the stomach's going to be inhibited. It's going to shut down to a point by the sympathetic nervous system. Because it doesn't matter if you digest the lunch you ate if you die. So they're going to reroute all that information to areas to help you survive versus digesting your food. Now, this is important. This dual innervation is important because this means that they're constantly going back and forth. And guys, within an hour, a minute in your body, these two divisions are constantly going back and forth. Okay, taking over control, helping you be able to survive. Okay, it's kind of like if you were sitting in a class and the teacher said, hey, get out a piece of paper, we're going to have a pop quiz. You were in maybe your parasympathetic where you were resting, you were calm, but once they said pop quiz, you started to panic or get stressed. Your sympathetic takes over. Okay, and so we see there's a constant back and forth that occurs between these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Now, neurons of the autonomic nervous system, we've used two terms here where we talk about cholergenic and what we would say androgenic. Cholergenic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. This acetylcholine may excite the next neuron or tissue, or it may inhibit it. All of the sympathetic and parasympathetic pre-ganglionic neurons are going to be cholergenic. All of the parasympathetic post-ganglionic neurons are going to be cholergenic. Now, a few of the sympathetic post-ganglionic neurons may be cholergenic when we're talking about sweat glands or certain blood vessels, but for the most part, the post-ganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system are going to be the next group, which are the androgenic neurons. These are going to release norepinephrine, like noradrenaline, or epinephrine that we also call adrenaline. These also could be excitatory or inhibitory depending on what effector they're talking to. So some neurotransmitters, when we look at this, okay, they may excite over here, but they may inhibit over here. So even though they're the same neurotransmitter, who they're talking to, the receptor, the effector that they're talking to could have a different effect based on the receptors that are present on that tissue. All right, so now we've looked at kind of how the sympathetic and parasympathetic looks, okay, structural wise, what it kind of releases, that sort of thing. Now let's talk about more of what it does. Okay, what are the functions? Now, the sympathetic division is your stress state. Okay, it's going to be in control when you are stressed. we're going to see an increased energy demand. This is your survival mode, so it's going to need more energy. This is going to cause your body to release more glucose so that we can break that glucose into ATP. But in order to do this, we may need to break down our reserves or our stores of glycogen. If we break it down from glycogen to glucose, this is called glycogenolysis because we're breaking the glucoses off. This increased need is going to also increase your need for oxygen and nutrients in order for your mitochondria to be able to produce the ATP. Therefore, this is going to be mostly run by catabolic reactions where we're breaking things apart, releasing energy. On the other hand, when we look at the parasympathetic division, this is the relaxation state. This means that there's going to be a decrease in your energy demands. You don't need as much energy to survive here. So instead of using that energy, we're going to store it. We're going to store the glucose for later as glycogen, and we're going to do this through glycogenesis. We're going to make glycogen. This takes place a lot of times in your liver and your muscles. We may also store lipids. We'll store these fats or lipids in our adipose tissue. This is called lipogenesis. We're storing it away for a later time. Now, because we're building these and we're storing them away, these are what we call anabolic reactions. We're storing the energy, and we're building products. Now, normally you're not in one or the other. Normally these are constantly going back and forth, which means there's more of an intermediate stage where there's a back and forth between your sympathetic and parasympathetic. However, in certain situations, the sympathetic will take over for a longer time, and in others, the parasympathetic will take over for a longer time. Okay, but most of the time you're kind of in an intermediate where there's a balance between these two. All right, so let's look at the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and let's look at these effects on specific organs, okay, what it has those organs do. All right, so we have here the sympathetic postganglionic neuron, which remember these are the androgenic. They're going to release norepinephrine or epinephrine. And on the parasympathetic side, we have the postganglionic neurons going to be cholergenic, where they release acetylcholine. All right, so let's look at the adrenal medulla. When we look at the adrenal medulla, that inner part of the adrenal glands, remember that the sympathetic nervous system has a direct line to them. So this is going to cause them to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine and help with this fight or flight situation by releasing these into the bloodstream. But if you'll notice, guys, the parasympathetic does not communicate with the adrenal medulla. There's no innervation. Therefore, this organ does not have dual innervation because both systems are not talking to them. Okay, production of sweat and goosebumps. If we look at this one, again, this is going to be a single innervation by the sympathetic nervous system. Then this increases sweat in the most areas of your body, like the soles of your feet and the palms of your hand. That's why when you get real nervous, like before an interview or something, your hands may feel real sweaty and clammy. We also see goosebumps are going to be formed by the sympathetic nervous system, where there's contraction of that erector pili, okay, the little smooth muscle that is connected to each hair, and it causes them to stand up. The parasympathetic does not talk to these at all. Now for the liver though, the liver does have dual innervation. With the liver, we see that the sympathetic is going to do the glycogenolysis because we're going to break that down. This is going to raise your blood glucose because we're releasing glucose to your bloodstream. On the other hand, the parasympathetic, we're going to do glycogenesis. We're going to take the glucose out of the bloodstream and we're going to store it for later. So it's going to lower your blood glucose levels. All right, what about heart rate and how hard it contracts, the force? We see that the sympathetic is going to increase your heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic is going to decrease it. Again, dual innervation. All right, what about your pupils? Okay, when we talk about our eyes. When we look at the sympathetic is going to do dilation of the pupils, opening them up so that you can get more information in, whereas the parasympathetic is going to allow for constriction to take place. When we look at the lungs, if the sympathetic nervous system is in control, we have bronchodilation. The bronchioles are going to dilate, and this is going to increase your respiration rate, your breathing rate. On the other hand, if you don't need that extra oxygen, you're resting, the parasympathetic takes over and it's going to do bronchoconstriction. Hey, it's not going to stop you from breathing. It's just not going to use more of the area of the lungs than it needs to. Hey, it's kind of like conserving energy in that sense. All right, what about the stomach and the intestines? We see the sympathetic is going to decrease the activity of your GI tract. Okay, it's going to cause contraction of your sphincters. Sphincters are on each end of that digestive tract. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, is going to increase the activity of the GI tract. Relaxation of the sphincters, allowing the food to move through so digestion can continue. All right, bladder. So in the sympathetic, we see that there's going to be a contraction of the internal sphincter and relaxation of the wall, so it's not going to allow for normally the urine to leave. It's normally after the fact, when you've calmed down and you feel safer, that then you may end up peeing yourself after you were scared. This is because the parasympathetic starts to take over and we have relaxation of the internal sphincter. Then the muscular walls can contract and release the urine. When we look at the uterus, if the sympathetic nervous system comes in, it inhibits contraction. This is important in a non-pregnant woman. It helps promote labor contractions, however, in a pregnant woman. Okay, we don't want to have contractions all the time if we're not pregnant. Those aren't comfortable. It's not something that we really need to happen because there's no point in them. If we look at the sex organs, in the sympathetic, we have contraction of the smooth muscle. This results in ejaculation when we talk about in males. So in that process of climax in a male, the sympathetic nervous system is going to end up taking over. Okay. When we talk about the parasympathetic, this is going to cause vasodilation, which results in the erection in both sexes, male and female. And if you'll notice, when we talk about sexual intercourse, we want both of these systems working. The parasympathetic needs to be in charge first in order for the man or woman to be excited. But for climax to take place, the sympathetic nervous system then takes over. All right, blood pressure. When we look at the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to increase your blood pressure, whereas the parasympathetic is normally going to decrease your blood pressure. Blood vessels to vital organs. If we're going to the vital organs, we see that vasodilation is going to happen in the sympathetic, so it's going to get larger, delivering more blood to the area. In the parasympathetic, we're going to have vasoconstriction. We're not in a life or death situation, so we can constrict it to where the blood's distributed more evenly through the body. Blood vessels to non-vital organs. These are going to do the opposite. The non-vital organs in the sympathetic are going to have vasoconstriction, whereas we see vasodilation in the parasympathetic. Okay, so opposite of vital organs, okay, that we saw above. All right, so this brings us to where we talk about some visceral autonomic reflexes. Reflexes are discussed a lot when we talk about the spinal cord, and with reflexes, we see that these reflexes will adjust the activity of a visceral effect. Remember, this is usually unconscious because of the fact that it's the autonomic system. The message never actually reaches that top part of your brain that we call the cerebral cortex. So this could be a change in your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration rate. You're not even really aware that it's occurring. Vasoconstriction or dilation of your blood vessels. Your pupils contracting or dilating. It's not like you have to sit there and be like, okay, I'm about to go outside. All right, pupils, let's go. Let's get ready to constrict. No, they're going to automatically do this. And this is because it's a reflex that takes place. So let's look at what the reflex arc looks like. And it does look exactly like the reflex arc pretty much of a somatic reflex, kind of like your knee jerk or like patella when the doctor hits your knee and it kicks out. We see it's very similar here. So the receptor is going to be located throughout the body, and the receptor has to receive the information first. Once it receives the information, it's going to travel through the sensory neuron. These are located throughout the body, and they're labeled here in this picture as number 2. We then see there's an association neuron. These are located in the spinal cord, medulla, and hypothalamus. Now this is important because the information never gets all the way up to the cerebral cortex. Now these are not actually shown here because of the fact that we don't have the medulla and hypothalamus shown in this particular picture. We then see a motor response has to take place. The autonomic motor neurons are going to be the preganglionic. So if it's a sympathetic axon, remember these are shorter. Parasympathetic, they're longer. And the postganglionic, we see the sympathetic axons, they're anergenic, so they're going to release the epinephrine, norepinephrine, whereas the parasympathetic are going to be cholinergic, so they are going to release acetylcholine. They are going to talk then to the effector. Now this effector is a visceral effector, which means it's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. We are not talking to skeletal muscles here. That's the somatic reflex arc. Now, last thing here that we want to kind of hit when we talk about the autonomic nervous system is that the autonomic nervous system is controlled mostly by the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is located here in the brain. It's a small portion in kind of the middle lower part of the brain, and it's going to be the switch station for the sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's going to help us determine what needs to happen. Does our heart rate need to increase or decrease? Does our blood pressure need to increase or decrease? And this area is going to be constantly monitoring and then making adjustments. And it's going to do this through the autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. All right, if you've got any questions, please let me know.